you. So a really warm welcome to 56 people. And actually it is rather a gorgeous day. I've got the sun shining into my eyes, which is rather a pleasant experience at the moment. So today what we're going to do is share the following hour talking about safety 2. And so Andrew is who, as you can see, is from Queen's University, Kingston, Canada. Has been working and studying safety 2 for a while now. He and I have had a chat previously, and we're very much in alignment in respect of the fact that safety 2 is so much more than just the kind of misunderstanding that it's just about success. Safety 2 is encompasses all sorts of things about how we work, what actually does work, what doesn't, how we imagine people work, and how they actually work. And how we can cope with the complex adaptive system that healthcare is. And it's growing in terms of our knowledge, it's growing in terms of the spread across in relation to people wanting to know more, wanting to understand more. But I think that's possibly where we've got to. So lots of awareness, quite a lot of understanding, although as I say, I think there's some misunderstandings. But then what we now need to start to think about is the so what. So what next? How do you do this? Who's doing it? And all of those things. So I think what Andrew's going to do, I know Andrew's going to do, is set us up for a really, really great conversation together. And so the first thing I'm going to do is hand over to Andrew. Then the second thing I'm going to do is have a quick chat with Andrew, and then we will open it out for conversations amongst as many people as we can. So have a think about, as Andrew is speaking, your questions, your thoughts, your ideas, what this might mean to you. And this is just simply an hour. And so afterwards, if you want more, if you need more, we have lots of ways in which we can provide you with references and more information, but also you can chat to us on Twitter via our addresses, at which I've put right at the beginning of the chat. So without further ado, my first thing to do is to hand over to Andrew on why safety 2 matters.
Okay. All right, well, thank you very much. And just maybe just to make sure everyone can hear me, I just see some nods. Perfect. Okay, so I want to thank everyone for being here, and thank you very much for the opportunity to speak to you today. And what I'm going to talk to you today about is why I believe safety 2 matters in healthcare. I'm going to issue a slight apology at the start. This is going to be a somewhat short talk. I want to leave as much time as possible for discussion at the end. So I will go a little bit, perhaps a little bit quickly over a few things. But again, the point is to leave as much time for discussion. Oh, sorry. I'm going to start off with just with an outline, and this slide here is really the essence of the next 20 minutes or so, the fundamentals of what I'm going to say distilled into 3 points. So 1, safety 1 thinking has dominated discourses surrounding healthcare quality and safety. This has diverted attention away from the importance of practical expertise. And the third point, I think, really sums up why I think safety 2 matters. Safety 2, and perhaps more importantly, complexity science, redirect our gaze towards the practical expertise and non-codified work that are crucial in complex systems. I think that right there is the essence of the talk. Yeah, if you get anything else from it, it's gravy. It's this this slide is really what I want to convey. In terms of objectives for the talk, I'm going to be honest, I've never really been very good at coming up with objectives. So, you know, in all honesty, I think at the end of this talk, a lot of you are really probably going to be disappointed with it. I say that for a couple of reasons. One, this talk, or at least this portion, ends with questions rather than answers, which can always be a bit disappointing. 2, I think some people out there might find what I say a bit, you know, perhaps a bit trite, and that's okay. And 3, some people may disagree with some of the things that I say or some of the conclusions I end up at. I think all of those reactions are quite reasonable, and again, that's part of the reason why I want to leave a lot of time for discussion at the end. But I'm going to jump right in and start off by giving you a bit of background on my sort of journey through healthcare quality and safety. I did my medical training sort of between about 2002 through 2010. And that was at a time when quality and safety was just sort of entering into the discussion in healthcare. They're really becoming established in the zeitgeist, if you will, of healthcare and medicine. So it was something that was growing as I grew up. And then in my first year as an attending physician, or I think in the UK, what would be called a consultant, I, unfortunately witnessed a few adverse events where patients suffered harm from what at the time were described as preventable adverse events. And that experience got me interested in wanting to contribute to quality and safety. So what I first did was I did a quality improvement fellowship, and then after that followed up with a master's degree in healthcare quality and safety. And through those formal avenues, as one can imagine, I really got exposed to a lot of the sort of traditional ideas and concepts of quality and safety. So things that are familiar to everyone here. For example, the hierarchy of intervention effectiveness. Things that really got pounded into us were standardization, automation. Education alone is not sufficient for improvement. Eliminating variation, those types of things. A lot of discussion about lean and the need to eliminate waste. And then as well, that's a line that seems to follow you everywhere you go in health quality and safety, that every system is perfectly designed to achieve the results it gets. Always struck me as a little bit strange, that idea that design is destiny, absolutely. But nonetheless, this was what I was exposed to, and I took it all in. For a while I talked the talk, or to use another metaphor, I drank the proverbial Kool-Aid. When I thought about health quality and health safety, the vision that I had in my mind, my mental image of it was this traditional picture. But over the years, I think that a strange thing started to happen. And that was that the vision, that traditional vision of what quality and safety in healthcare meant, or how to achieve it, really, it did not match what I was seeing on the front lines in clinical experience. So on the front lines, what I was seeing was that, when things went well, it was usually because of frontline clinicians exercising their expertise, applying their expertise, figuring out how to adapt, how to improvise, how to manage competing demands. So that was what created success. That's what largely made good things happen. It was very unusual for anyone to say, well, hey, everything went according to plan and we didn't have to make any adjustments. It really was that ability to adapt and improvise in the setting of dynamic circumstances that seemed to be driving a lot of the quality and safety I saw. So that started to challenge that formal view that I had been given through formal avenues. And other things that I started to notice as well was what I've called here the tyranny of metrics, and the subject of a book a couple of years ago, where I think a lot of clinicians felt like their responsibility to numbers was starting to intrude upon their responsibility to people, their responsibility to patients. And then a further thing that I really couldn't help but notice was that it seemed as the emphasis, the hard emphasis on quality, safety, metrics, and things such as that seemed to coincide, or at least overlap a bit, with growing concerns about clinician wellness and clinician burnout. So seeing those things started to raise some questions in my mind about that highly formalized view of quality and safety that I had encountered in formal training. And as those questions were sort of smoldering in my mind, it was around that time that I essentially discovered a new literature base, the work of a few authors, Suzette included in that group, people talking about safety too. And that was a perspective that, while I'd been sort of gaining steam, at the time I had not been exposed to it whatsoever through the formal training that I had gotten. And I remember reading these articles right off the bat, and it really was an eye-opening moment encountering this, because I started to think, yes, that's a lot closer to what I see actually happening. This seems to reflect the reality of how we go about day in, day out work. Okay, so I started to look quite a bit more into the Safety 1 and Safety 2 paradigm, if you will. Now, I don't have time to do an exhaustive exploration of Safety 1 and Safety 2, but somewhat, briefly, just with this slide, Safety 1, it's the perspective that looks at safety as the state where as few things as possible go wrong. Or the way I think of it is sort of the paradise lost view of quality and safety. So it's the idea that the default state of our systems is safe, is high quality. So as long as you follow these designs, follow these idealized plans, everything's going to be okay. And it's only if deviations happen, if you stray from the plan, that you run into problems. So in other words, the idea is, we can specify the way to do something, and then just make sure we follow these specifications. From that starting point, problems are the result of malfunctions, or I should say problems or incidents arise due to malfunctions or deviations. We investigate incidents in order to find those malfunctions and deviations so that they can be eliminated. Now, importantly, there are a few other aspects to the Safety 1 point of view, and whether intentional or not, and it's probably not intentional, but working within that Safety 1 perspective, it's hard not to start to see the front lines as the source or the site of the malfunctions and deviations. So the front lines sort of become that area where our idealized plans accumulate blemishes. Furthermore, it paints performance variability as something that's harmful and something that should be prevented. There are some somewhat strong echoes of Taylorism within Safety 1, whereby if what we can do is specify the right way to do it, we just have to make sure that we do that, and the best things happen when we don't stray from those plans. Now, contrast that Safety 1 perspective with the Safety 2 perspective, which is commonly sort of succinctly stated as making sure things go right. It's a little bit more than that, in my opinion. It's really the perspective that safety or high quality is something that is created out of the chaos of normal day in, day out work. It's created by people exercising their expertise, people adapting, improvising, finding a way to translate that chaos into what we call safety or what we call quality. That starting point leads to different perspectives on why problems occur and why we investigate things. But most importantly, it creates a quite different attitude towards the front lines. From the starting point of Safety 2 and the starting point of, I should have said, of complexity science, or with a background of complexity, the people at the front lines and the expertise that they possess becomes a resource. It becomes actually an essential aspect of our systems, something that's needed to provide the system with flexibility and resilience it would not otherwise have. Without that expertise, or if that expertise is constrained too much, we actually end up with very brittle systems that, in the setting of complexity, can't deal with the unpredictable, emergent, dynamic conditions that one faces in fields such as healthcare. Furthermore, safety 2 sort of leads to a very different view on performance variability. It seems obvious when you view it from this point of view, but performance variability from a safety 2 perspective is something that's necessary. That if one is working in circumstances that are dynamic and changing frequently, then one needs to alter their performance as well in order to make things go well. So that's a very quick overview of the two perspectives and the distinctions between the two. And just thinking back, seeing this articulated for the first time a few years ago, it really was an eye-opening moment for me. And it was at that time that I realized that all of the formal training that I'd had in quality and safety really was delivered from a safety 1 perspective. And that really was hammered home, at least in my experience, just a few years ago. But realizing that in combination with the questions that had arisen in my mind, I started to think, well, geez, maybe the way we're discussing this, the way we're thinking about this actually isn't conducive to the complex realities in which we practice medicine. So the way we're trying to improve quality and safety actually doesn't fit the environments that we're working in. And that led me to a few more sort of provocative questions that I started asking that occasionally got me, dirty looks in conferences. But I started wondering to myself, could the dominance of safety 1 thinking in healthcare interfere with normal day in, day out work? And 2, could this dominance of safety 1 thinking be tied to, the increasing concerns about clinician wellness and clinician well-being that we're seeing? Now, those are questions that I explore in the BMJ Quality and Safety article. I'm not going to sort of give a full overview of the article, but I do want to touch on one thread within that article because I think it does illustrate quite nicely what Safety 2 provides. And the one thread I just want to touch on is that of high modernism. This is a concept that I discovered in a very wonderful book by an anthropologist, James Scott. The book is called Seeing Like a State. And within that book, Scott describes high modernism. It's an ideology. He describes it as a trumped up, almost religious belief in the utility of scientific and technological knowledge. But not just within the domains of science and technology. It's a belief that those principles, those approaches, can actually be applied across disciplines to great effect. And particularly, it's about our confidence in our ability to use that knowledge to organize our social systems. In other words, to what he describes as imposing rational design upon our social systems. Now, within high modernism, the path to social improvement lies through a few techniques. So one, the first he stresses is legibility. So taking a complex reality and essentially sort of reducing it into something simple, something understandable, something legible. Practically speaking, that usually means making it quantitatively legible, so converting things into metrics. So that's going to be familiar to many in healthcare. The example is, we're providing great care in this hospital because our lengths of stay are below a benchmark. or our dwell times in the emergency department are below the standard. So the first step is legibility. The second is rational design. So again, echoing elements of Taylorism. Find the best way to do something, specify it, and then export it. And then finally, centralized oversight. So you need someone or some body to ensure that that rational design is being followed through with. Now, that's all a somewhat superficial description of high modernism, but even from that, perhaps you can see that that there are fingerprints of that ideology throughout healthcare. And high modernism, in a way, is actually in many ways is the sort of underlying conceptual framework for a lot of our safety one approaches. Now, it can be productive. It can work. However, there's one large issue with high modernism, and Scott spends a lot of time in his book outlining this. He says that the main issue with high modernism is that in elevating scientific and technical knowledge, in elevating this very explicit, codified knowledge, what it tends to do is marginalize practical knowledge and practical expertise. So that tacit, non-codified, context-specific knowledge and expertise that people develop through their training, through their experience, through working on their jobs day in, day out, that tends to get marginalized. Now, it doesn't go away. It's still necessary, but it's pushed out of the spotlight. It becomes something that doesn't receive as much attention, doesn't receive as much discussion. Now, you can get past that in simpler systems or predictable systems that aren't so dynamic. But marginalizing practical expertise becomes a big issue in complex socio-technical systems. Again, complex systems that can't be specified a priori, systems that are dynamic, systems that are unpredictable, systems with a lot of competing demands. It's really hard to specify how to act in those circumstances, and you need people with expertise. You need that practical knowledge and expertise to make those quick decisions, to be able to identify when things are changing and figure out on the fly how to respond. Again, that still happens in a high modernist ideology, but it's pushed to the side, pushed out of attention. And Scott sort of summarizes that with a very nice quote where he says, "Formal schemes of order are untenable without some elements of the practical knowledge they tend to dismiss." Okay, so in other words, though we dismiss it, practical knowledge bails us out. And I bring up that issue just because in my opinion, that sort of illustrates why safety 2 matters. And as concisely as I can say it, I think safety 2 does a lot of things, but the most important thing it does is it brings practical knowledge and expertise back from the margins. It brings it back into the spotlight. In many ways, at least in my opinion, the view of patient safety, of quality, that has largely been dominant throughout healthcare is a safety 1 view, a technocratic view, which is to say a high modernist view. A view that marginalizes practical expertise, makes it invisible, takes it out of discussions, such that we don't appreciate it, we don't see the toll exercising it takes on clinicians at the front lines, and prevents discussions about how to facilitate it. And to me, this is why safety 2 matters. It brings practical knowledge and expertise back into our attention, highlights it as the glue that holds our systems together, and positions it as something we need to discuss and facilitate, which is to say, we need to realize how to build slack into our systems to allow people to implement to exercise their expertise effectively. Now, on that note, I'm going to just pause and say at the start, I did warn you that at the end of this, you would be disappointed. And I bring that back now because this is where I'm stopping. As I said, I also said at the beginning, some of you may disagree with what I've said. Some may find it trite, or many are probably thinking, yeah, great, but what do we do now? Those are all reasonable reactions, and hopefully something that we can discuss in the follow-up. There are many questions that remain on the road ahead. A few that sort of bounce around my mind are, to what extent does Safety 2 provide concrete, practical benefits in addition to any conceptual benefits it might provide? What does an effective balance of Safety 1 and Safety 2 actually look like? And 2, is Safety 2 possible in a system with high modernist underpinnings? So I'm going to stop there, reiterate my conclusions. Again, this is the essence of what I tried to convey. In particular, the third point, Safety 2 and complexity science redirect our gaze towards the practical expertise and non-codified work that are crucial in complex systems. And with that, I will conclude. So thanks very much for listening, and I think back to Suzette.
Thank you, Andrew. That's really brilliant and much food for thought, I think, for all of us. I've asked for questions, comments, and thoughts, but I am thrilled that I have a small amount of time when you and I can just have a conversation about what you've just said. The sort of things that I get said to me in relation to Safety 2, the questions that I get asked. So I'm going to slightly pose them to you, and then you can have a think about which ones you'd like to think about. So the first one is always, okay, so we're drowning in information and data, and we're on this treadmill of Safety 1. And now you've added in the mix this whole thing of Safety 2. So how on earth do you think we can fit that in? And I've got my own answers to that in terms of something that also Sidney Dekker said, which is if you have to ask that question, you might actually be asking the wrong question, because it means that you're missing the point that it's a change in thought and it's a change in mindset. But so that's, I suppose, let me ask you that first question is, what is the answer to the people who say we don't have time to do Safety 2 because we've already got Safety 1? It's all too much already.
Yeah, so I think there's, I would take that from a few perspectives. So one, I would say I somewhat agree with, I would agree with what Dekker says in response to that. It perhaps is the wrong question because it really is sorry, I'll get my hands out of the way so I'm not blocking the screen. It is, it's in some ways the greatest value is the viewpoint, the perspective it provides. The opening part of the question, I think, is quite illustrative in that there is a large amount of data and information that everyone has to deal with, especially clinicians. And it's quite understandable to realize that people are drowning in it. And I think part of what breeds that is that idea of, the more knowledge we have, the better. The more data we have, the better. But I will sometimes say that a wealth of information is only useful if it does not lead to a paucity of attention. Okay. So the danger of too much information is that one loses the ability to attend to what is important. And I think in some ways, that message is reinforced by the Safety 2 perspective of figuring out, okay, here's how real world day in, day out work happens. Here's how we make sense of the chaos around it by attending to these specific elements. So I think in some ways the Safety two perspective actually provides conceptually a way to figure out how to start to deal with the wealth of information, or the overload of information. You know, we have to figure out, you know, what are we using this for, and how do we properly attend to it? How do we use this wealth of information successfully in the chaos of day in and day out work? That was second. There was a third point that now has escaped my my mind. It was the best one. I was leaving it until the end. Gosh.
No problem. Maybe it'll come back to you.
Yeah.
But I do think there's something about, there's some really nice references. Cole McRae is a person who writes a lot about resilience engineering. He wrote a really lovely article called "The Problem with Incident Reporting" in the British Medical Journal, the Quality and Safety component of it. And he, for me, I think he described beautifully the filing. He described it as a British Airways set up incident reporting systems, and it was filing cabinet after filing cabinet after filing cabinet. And I just totally remember my whole world as a long time ago as a risk manager. I literally had an office which was massive, and it just had filing cabinet after filing cabinet of stuff. And there was no way I was ever going to really truly get to the heart of that. So one of the things I'm really interested in, my second question, because I really want to get on to everyone else's, but is in the answer to trying to study complex adaptive systems, we're currently using tools which are used for linear systems, so root cause analysis being one of them. So our whole world in healthcare, particularly in the UK, is incident reporting systems, and then instant investigations, predominantly using root cause analysis. And again, my concern is that, are we truly actually being able to understand people's daily lived experience through a root cause analysis methodology? So that's a question I'd like to ask you.
Yeah, so I think that the premise of the question is an excellent is you know, an excellent point, and in some ways it's the, you know, the essence of what we're trying to deal with. You know, in terms of the direct question, you know, do root cause analyses, you know, reflect the reality of people's, you know, lived experience? I mean, I think reasonable people can disagree on that. I would say probably no. It's you know, the root cause analysis is a reflection of an incident through the lens of hindsight, through the lens of all the biases people bring with them to those incidents. But the sort of the deeper aspect of the question is, we have these systems of safety, these systems of quality that have been set up under a certain paradigm. And now we're saying, well, you know, let's move to a different paradigm. Is that really possible? Okay, so to what extent can we do safety too within, you know, the mechanics that have already been set up? I don't know the answer to that question, but I think it's fascinating to discuss. I think some of the legitimate criticisms of safety 2 that are out there is that it's somewhat, when you actually get to implementing it, it starts to betray itself, because what it ends up being is you end up playing the same game just with a different vocabulary. Mm-hmm. So you end up doing what would be called the safety 1 things, calling them something differently. And that's probably because it's just within the structures that we've had that have been laid down. It's just really hard to envision how to make that change. So we fall back on, you know, the root cause analyses, the specifications, the standardization, all of those familiar familiar tools, and we don't really make a clean break. So I think that's fascinating because it leads into the questions. Well, what does a safety 2 approach really look like in real life? It's somewhat hard to envision that. And I think a lot of people from the complexity science field, that's why they're a little bit lukewarm on safety 2. They say, it's a good start and it's a move in the right direction, but it stops short of what it's actually speaking about. So I think that's somewhat of a wandering answer. Forgive me for that, but I think that question touches on one of the great challenges with safety 2 is, how do we create real change? How do we make sure that any change we do isn't just, as I said, playing the same game with different language?
Yeah, that's really, really interesting. And slightly counter to some of the things that I think the advice I've given in the past, which is perhaps, well, what you might want to do is use the same methodology, but ask some different questions. But I can see also that what people are really trying to do in Eric Holnagel's world and various others, they're really trying to think, but are there some tools out there that might help us differently? And I think that he's landed on a few of them, and they're relatively complex in themselves. So functional resonance, I'm going to get that wrong, FRAM, functional resonance ambiguity methodology, something like that. So at the moment, I think that we're making the operationalization, if there is one, of safety 2 a little bit complex in itself.
Yeah. So if I can just go, FRAM is something that I find very interesting, because to me, and I should say I'm not an expert in much, but certainly not in FRAM. FRAM seems to me to be an effort in some ways to flatten complexity. Yeah. To translate a complex process into a complicated process. It's the idea, because it seems that inherent within constructing these FRAM diagrams, inherent within that process is the assumption that we can take the complex reality and translate it into what is essentially some way a linear diagram. Now it's linear in a lot of different directions, but still there is an idea that we can specify to a large degree what we see in front of us. Now it's quite possible that there are aspects of FRAM that I'm missing, but it does seem to undo a little bit of the complexity that is present in the world. Now it still often ends up being very, very useful, but it seems to me that it's sort of stuck in a limbo between being truly a way to deal with complexity and just treating things as complicated. So I've always looked at FRAM with a certain amount of fascination for that reason.
So I'm moving over to the questions that people are making. I'm not going to pick one in particular at the moment. What I'm going to do is share them and see what their themes are around them. So there's, how do we manage competing expertise? How much cultural change and clinician input would a shift towards safety 2 require? How do you assign value to differing practical experience? Why has safety 1 been the dominant paradigm for so long? I hadn't considered the lack of acceptance or priority around tacit knowledge of clinicians and healthcare professionals when reviewing incidents and investigations. So there's a theme around the knowledge of clinicians and it not just being about facts and figures and this is what the statements are saying and so on. And it's about, I think that's something about the theme around really trying to understand the human factor term work as done, the real lived experience of people. But there's another theme coming through, which is, so how do you balance safety 1 and safety 2? And how do you shift away from it when the predominant approach is driving us towards safety 1? So the predominant approach is doing that because it's what the system expects, it's what the appraisal systems and revalidation systems expect of us, and it sort of drive us down one way. So how do we actually shift the system beyond? And for me, I think it's about providing real positive evidence that it actually works and actually makes a difference. And there are lovely ways in which we might be able to do that. And so then moving on to the complex systems, and the preventative portion of working in complex systems is really hard to measure, absolutely, because you're kind of measuring nothing. If it hasn't happened, you can't measure it as such. So how do we actually, because then therefore another pressure, which is to shift us back to the things that we can measure. So I suppose the themes in relation to some of the questions that I'm seeing so far is, how do you balance safety 1 and safety 2? How do you move away from the predominant approach, because that's what we're being driven to do, and how do you measure it? I think you covered some of that in your talk, but so sort of briefly, some really, really huge questions to see what your thoughts are on what those are.
Yeah, hopefully I can address that, but if what I say leads to further questions, and then please anyone follow up. I think in trying to tie that all together into an answer, I would say that there is a, I'm struggling to describe this, but there is very much a move to quantify as much as possible within healthcare, within many fields. One of the dangers of that is that some people call it a benefit, other people say it's a danger, but we have to be careful not to replace what are political discussions, what are qualitative discussions about values, about what good work means, what safety means, what quality means. Those are largely qualitative discussions that in many ways over the last 15 or so years have been shifted increasingly towards quantitative discussions. So rather than discussing values or definitions or what our shared concept or shared understanding of a good outcome is, those discussions get shifted into, are we meeting the benchmarks? To what extent are we, how do we compare numerically with other similar hospitals? And unfortunately, that flattens a lot of those discussions. And as I said before, it can marginalize a lot of the things that we really should be talking about. So, for instance, just probably not everyone was logged on, but the anecdotes that we heard before we started about work in hospice, about the learning from excellence stories. Those are largely qualitative stories that don't involve numbers, but that speak to us and illustrate what it means to people to do good work, to do fulfilling work, for patients to feel cared for. If we allow the qualitative aspects of those discussions to be marginalized, then all that we're left with is a numbers game, and I think that becomes less fulfilling for the people working at the front lines, the patients being cared for everyone. So I think that's that tension between the qualitative discussions and the quantitative nature of our discussions is a tension we have to be very attuned to, it's one that, you know, a safety one perspective can kind of lead us to, you know, lean towards the quantitative. Whereas a safety two perspective, that idea of, you know, okay, you know, what does real work look like? What is happening day in, day out? You know, what is your lived experience? In some ways, that can be the corrective force against leaning too far in that quantitative direction. Just if anyone is looking for further reading, and just again on anecdotes that things came before, that idea of how qualitative discussions get replaced with quantitative discussions is the subject of actually another book by James Scott. It's called Two Cheers for Anarchy, in which he goes over a lot. He uses a lot of. It's actually a fairly short book. It's only about 100 pages. So it's a fairly quick and very interesting read. He goes over some case studies and some examples of what happens when you know, when our discussions shift in that direction, and the dangers it carries when that happens in terms of the administration of socio-technical systems.
Brilliant.
Sorry,
Thank you.
I'm talking for too long.
No. Somebody's obviously read your article, which was in the British Medical Journal, as I recall it, to do with clinician burnout. So they're wondering whether you could expand on I can't remember the exact title of you will know what your exact title was, but it was to do with mitigating clinician burnout in relation to safety 1 and safety 2. Do you think you could expand a little bit more on what your article was about?
Yeah. So the gist of the article was sort of those sort of three points that I sort of the three highlighting points that clearly something is happening on the front lines with respect to burnout. You know, there's clear patterns that phenomenon is rising. It's not completely well understood, and I think part of what stimulated me to read want to write about it was I think that there are a few somewhat unfortunate developments occurring in terms of the attempt to combat burnout. One is the effort to build individual resilience, which as other people will probably feel as well, can stray awfully close to victim blaming. And the other aspect of it is that it's becoming subject to some safety one interventions itself, where people want to study it, figure out, okay, well, this is what we need to do to fix it. Let's implement it, and see what happens. That's the way to solve it. And one of the smartest things that I've heard after writing the article, one of the things that I wish I had thought of that was I heard someone say that one of the problems with combating burnout is that we keep proposing technocratic solutions to what is a problem created by technocratic solutions. So basically, we keep digging the hole deeper and deeper. So what I tried to do in the article was to use the principles of safety two, to use the principles of complexity science to take a different look at the burnout phenomenon, and really to again put the focus back on what are the things that people do day in, day out, and can we understand why that's so draining? So rather than starting from the premise of the imagined drivers of burnout, let's look at what people are really doing. Let's look at the nature of the work that they're doing. And if you actually look at what people are expected to do at the front lines of healthcare these days, it's I mean, the volume of work is astounding, and the margins for error are very narrow. And I think the way I didn't state it, I'm not sure if I stated it explicitly in the article, but you know, one of the things that I think we have to look you know, very seriously about is this idea of slack in the system. You know, right now there is very little, and I should say, I'm speaking from my experience of what's happening in Canada, but I suspect it's very similar in other areas. There's very little slack anywhere in the system, whether it's in hospitals, whether it's in primary care offices, or in community care. Really, everyone is going above and beyond the call of duty to help make good things happen. And really what we're doing is we're downloading all of the demands onto the backs of those at the front lines.
Yeah.
So long as we continue to do that, I think burnout is an inevitable outcome, and one that will grow will just continue to grow. So hopefully what I hope, you know, people reading the article take away from it is the idea of finding ways to build slack into the system. That doesn't, I mean, one difficult way to do that is simply increase the amount of resources. It's not always feasible. But again, as you mentioned in anecdotes that, you know, before we started, you know, there are other ways to find slack through, you know, the learning from excellence exercises that you mentioned, but also making sure we avoid the things that excessively constrain or that put new barriers in place for people at the front lines. You know, we've over the last few years, I think there's a tendency to do that, and the degree to which it's helping anything is I think is debatable. Again, I apologize. I have a tendency to ramble.
No. I'm right tapping away because it's just brilliant for me anyway. So I've also been putting in some links. So there are some people who are saying, well, really, is there clear evidence that Safety 1 doesn't work? And so I've referenced a book by Bob Weir's. I always miss the second author. That's really terrible. But at the moment, I can't remember the second author. But it's Still Not Safe, which I think is an outstanding book that describes historically why things are still not safe. For want of a shameless plug of my own stuff, but I've written two books, one called Rethinking Patient Safety and the other Implementing Patient Safety, both of which try to look at the history of safety and why we think Safety 1 isn't quite hitting the mark that we really expected, given the last 20 years of our efforts. And not only that, so I think it's important to realize that there is quite a lot of people looking at the last 20 years and saying, why not? So the National Patient Safety Foundation in the US, which is now in partnership with the Institute of Healthcare Improvement, also did a document, sort of paper, which talked about the 15 years of safety and whether it had made a difference or not. So there's lots of people coming together and asking genuinely positive questions in a way. They're trying to do it in a way which is respectful of our past, respectful of all of the effort that have people put in over the last 20 years, but just saying why we're not quite where we'd like to be. And I think they're coming up with some really interesting and lovely answers. So there are a lot of references that we can share with people. And I think the other thing is that builds on your burnout point is that there are some amazing references associated with the sort of things that I wouldn't have imagined I'd be studying, having studied safety for a very long time, which is things like kindness and compassion and positive deviance and positive workplaces and health and well-being. And there's a book called Compassionomics, which is, you know, about this thick and is the evidence-based. Every single page is an evidence-based piece of information that tells you that compassion makes a massive difference in every way, for our patients, for our staff, for our bottom line, for the way in which we design stuff. And And so more and more and more, what we're seeing is social researchers, policy researchers starting to shift away from what you describe as the quantitative, hard fact, give me all of this, to a more qualitative, evaluative approach, but also starting to ask some really clever questions, which is, but could we quantify it as well? So there's somebody who has quantified value and gratitude and the difference it makes to performance. So actually, yes, we need both qualitative and quantitative data that shows us that these things work in order for us to convince people to actually make the effort. Because otherwise it's, as you say, we're all surrounded by pressure, lack of time, not enough staff, end of a busy day. Why should we do something different? And let's just stick with what we know. And actually, the more we convince people that what we know isn't quite working and that what we could do could make a really big difference to their lives, would be simply brilliant. And I think that's the point that we're at, which is the ability to try to do that. As I've got 3 minutes left, I'm now on some sort of rant. I think what I need to do is unfortunately, sadly, draw this to a close, because I think we could go on 4 hours. And I know that Andrew and I definitely could. But Andrew, a huge thanks. And remind me what time it is in Canada at the moment.
Well, it's not too bad. It's 9 o'clock in the
9 o'clock, not too bad. So early morning though. Thank you, and I bet you've been up much earlier preparing and getting yourself ready for it. So a huge thank you for your presentation and your thoughts, for all of the questions that have been posed either by me or the people on the call. A huge thank you to the people on the call who've listened attentively and come up with some most brilliant questions. I'm obsessed, so I think that we should have these conversations on a weekly, if not daily basis. But Matthew, thank you so much for letting us have the chance to do this. And if we have the chance to do it again, me, please, yes, that would be really lovely. So it's been an absolute joy. And a privilege to have this conversation. And I look forward to, over the coming years, our conversations getting richer and deeper, and a true understanding of safety too, as we go on. I'm going to hand you back to Matthew, who may have some last minute things associated with what's going on in either Q or the Health Foundation, or anything else you want to finish with.
Actually, funny enough, I was thinking the wrapping up would be you, but we have future Zooms coming up, very interesting ones. You know, where do we go when we get beyond target culture is one of the ones that's coming up. But thanks so much to Suzette and Andrew for getting into such a brilliant area with safety too, and making it kind of more understandable for people like me that are more new to it. And hopefully we can continue this conversation. You know, maybe Cindy Decker will speak to us one day. You know, that could be fun, something like that. I don't know. But thanks everyone, and thanks you too. See you all again soon. Look out for future Zooms on the Q website. There are some great ones coming up. Thanks everyone.
Yeah, thank you everyone for your time. Hopefully it was worthwhile.
And everybody whizzes off. There's all these click, 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 click.